All right. Hi. Welcome, everyone. I hope you had a good weekend. Um, Surprisingly, we actually only have really 2 more weeks of lectures left, and then the final. I know with the big break in the middle of the semester, the second half has been a bit shorter and a bit more condensed than the first half was. So with that, let me share my screen and let me start today's lecture. So I had originally hoped to have a local, someone local come in to guest speak for our class who works with a local organization that does ocean conservation. That's obviously not feasible anymore, that we're not having class, and he unfortunately was not able to record a lecture like Dr. Bergman was, which I hope you all enjoyed immensely. I thought that was incredibly informative. So instead of that, I put together basically a straight up lecture for today. We're going to go over different issues that have to do with ocean conservation and then talk about some of the policy solutions. And then I'm going to end by kind of talking about a few local organizations and how you can get involved in San Diego. This is a great opportunity because we actually live near the ocean. So unlike other locations, you actually can get involved here on a daily basis. Okay, so a few reminders. We do have extra credit opportunities. So assignment 4, which was originally a required assignment, is now extra credit because it does involve going to or participating in a SDSU environmental or conservation related event. That's obviously harder now that campus is on lockdown and closed. However, there are still online events going on, particularly this week because it is Earth Day coming up. So if you go to, I think it's SDSU Sustainability or Sustainable, they do have a few virtual events going on. So if you still want to be able to complete this assignment for extra credit, you can attend a virtual event as well, and SDSU related, and complete that assignment still. You can turn that in at any time for the end of the semester. And then the second is just the regular extra credit assignment that's been on the syllabus, and both of these are on the syllabus, but it's been on the syllabus since the beginning of the semester. The second reminder is that assignment 3 is due today, Monday at 2 p.m. So make sure you get that in on time. And then we do have a pink time number 2 coming up. So on Wednesday, there'll be no recorded lecture, no participation, nothing like that. Instead, you'll have that time to work on your own and to work on your pink time assignment. So this is going to be a little bit more, I don't know if challenging is the right word, but you're going to have to get a bit more creative this time, given that there are lots of constraints on what you can do. However, hopefully some of the citizen science stuff, as well as the kind of deep dive into different apps, will help you think of things you can do while you're at home. Still participate in pink time, obviously. And then this rubric, just like last time, is to the next class period, which is next Monday. It's the exact same rubric. It's available in course documents. If you have any questions, want to run your idea by me for what you hope to do, feel free to send me an email. Okay, so the learning objectives for today, as I mentioned, we're going to basically go through major issues facing our oceans, and then talk about different policy solutions for each of those issues. And then I do want to end by talking about some of the local conservation efforts here in San Diego and how you can get involved in that. So our oceans, just a map of the different oceans, and our oceans are important for a variety of reasons, environmental reasons, obviously, economic as well. They're a major source of income for millions and even billions of people around the world. And then for cultural reasons. Oceans can mean a lot in various cultures, particularly ones that are, on the coast. There's just a few quick facts about oceans. They do cover 71% of the Earth's surface and contain 97% of the Earth's water. So that's the majority of water found on Earth. Very little water on Earth is fresh water. However, only 20% of oceans have been mapped. So oftentimes we'll hear, oh, space is the unexplored frontier, but really our oceans are quite unexplored, and there's a lot that still hasn't been documented because they are so big and they are so deep and they are hard to access. It's hard to get to a lot of these places. The average depth is about 12,000 feet. So that's quite deep. That's, over 2 miles. And importantly, it's habitat to 230 known species. However, scientists estimate there could be over 2 million species just because, as I was just saying, oceans are relatively undocumented environments and undocumented ecosystems. And there's a lot of potential animals, wildlife, plants that exist there that we don't know about yet. So this is kind of a neat opportunity for folks who maybe want to go into that field and really try to just discover and describe more species that live in our oceans. At its deepest, the Mariana Trench, the ocean is 6.8 miles deep. It's incredibly deep. And then the ocean currents actually play a really important role in regulating our climate here on Earth. And we will talk a bit about that later in the lecture. And as I was mentioning, the stat says 3 billion people depend on oceans and coastal resources for their livelihood. So that's quite a large percentage of the world's population depends on oceans or the coast for, as some way to help feed their family and for their livelihood or their job. So challenges facing our oceans. This is from that Newsweek article that was assigned for today, where they kind of go through and list some of the major challenges, which I've listed here. And they also do talk about solutions as well. So that's, they're not trying to be totally negative. They do list solutions in the article, which we'll talk about some of those. But this list is really, it's really overwhelming, to be honest, because you have things that from these huge international issues to these more localized issues as well. And some of these are very, very different and need very, very different types of solutions. So I'm going to go through just a handful of these today. Obviously going through all of them would take quite a bit of time, so we'll go through a handful of these and then talk about the different policy solutions to each of them as I go through them. So the first one I want to cover is plastic pollution. This is something that's very obvious in San Diego. You walk along the beach, odds are fairly good you might come across some trash on the beach. A lot of that's going to be plastic. So from the Newsweek article for today, if you haven't yet watched the video that's at the beginning of the article, please do pause this lecture and go watch it. It's a really good introduction to plastic pollution. So pause the lecture and go watch the video. All right, welcome back. I'll pretend like you went and did that. They really cover different types of plastic pollution and a lot of different problems. So I want to talk about a few of these issues because just the problem with plastics pollution is varied within itself. So one that they do mention in the video is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or Pacific Vortex, which is basically a large amount of trash that's trapped in the middle of the Pacific Ocean due to the ocean currents there. This picture on the right is not, there obviously are places like that where the plastic pollution is not thick, but in most places it's actually much more spread out and the pollution is actually much more fine, smaller pieces of plastic. So to enormous masses, as it said, density varies. So in some places it's thicker than others. It ranges from 100 kilograms of plastic trash per square kilometer to 10 kilograms per square kilometer. 87 metric tons of plastic, or about 108 trillion pieces. I don't know how you estimate that, but that's the current estimate from scientists. And then the really important part here is that most of that plastics pollution is small. It's not like full bottles floating in the ocean. Most of it's been broken down to be a fingernail size or smaller. So that's these microplastics, which is about 94% of the plastics that are found in this vortex. So just the picture to the right gives you an idea of these tiny little pieces of plastic, which is obviously a huge problem because these pieces of plastic are things that could easily be eaten by wildlife. Plastics on the beach are also a huge problem. 90% of trash on beaches is plastic. And here's a list of the most commonly found This is based on stats and research that was done looking at litter pickups along beaches. And it looks at some of the most common types of beach plastic pollution. These are everyday things that a lot of us use, from bottles to wrappers, straws to lids, those kind of disposable plastic items that are fairly common, unfortunately, in our society. So policy solutions. So here's a few examples of recent legislation in the US. This first one here in 2015 is the Microbead Free Waters Act. And this bans rinse-off cosmetic products that perform an exfoliating function. So a lot of face wash have, they say it's an exfoliant, so it means it scrubs your skin. And before this act was in place, a lot of those kind of granules that were used as the exfoliant were made of plastic. So you can imagine you're washing your face, you wash that off, it goes down the drain. A lot of that might end up in the ocean eventually. So now instead of using plastics, these kind of products have to use other natural materials. And this took an effect in 2017. The other piece of kind of recent legislation was the Save Our Seas Act, which was signed in 2017. And this addresses a different problem. This looks more at intergovernmental relationships to address the marine debris problem. So it gets the US State Department, which is the US department that is involved in kind of international affairs and foreign relations, engaged in addressing marine debris. So the State Department now has a mandate to work with other countries, identify sources of ocean plastic, and help kind of talk to these countries and help them find different solutions so that not as much plastic is ending up in the ocean. It also does authorize NOAA and their marine debris program for 5 years of funding. So it'll help with also local efforts as far as providing funding for solving these issues of plastic floating out in the ocean. California, more locally, has also done some extra steps. This one here, 2018, AB 1884, single-use plastic. So this is basically the regulation that banned straws, plastic straws. I'm sure a lot of you have noticed if you go out to eat, you'll oftentimes receive a paper straw or no straw at all. And this is to help prevent a lot of these straws that are just used for, 10 minutes and then discarded from going into the ocean. However, unfortunately, with the last round of the Senate in September, there were 2 bills aimed at addressing plastic pollution. However, they failed. They were not voted into law. So Senate Bill 54 and then Assembly Bill 1080. They both sought to eliminate 75% of single-use containers by 2030. Reducing the glut, this is taken directly from the website, reducing the glut of unmarketable plastic statewide and laying the groundwork for revamped California recycling industry. So this is basically to get rid of those single-use plastics, which are most of the things, as we saw on the list of plastics that end up on the beach, at least. Most of those are those single-use plastic products: straws, bottles, takeout containers, plastic bags. However, this failed to pass. And one reason that I was reading about for why is because the California recycling industry is actually saying they're not equipped to take on a massive amount more of recycling, and it would be actually a huge amount of work, and they need a huge amount of funding in order to ramp up recycling efforts and their recycling facilities. So that, at least for what I was reading, was why these bills did not pass. Okay, changing topics. So another issue facing oceans is inadequate protection. So that means protection of ecosystems, protection of species. So as of 2017, marine protected areas covered about 6% of the ocean. This is much less than protected areas cover on land. So to address this, we'll talk about this a little bit. The target is for this year to have 10%, and then by 2030 to have at least 30%. So really to help extend that protection for marine areas. Some of the issues with marine protected areas is that just like protected areas on land, they do vary based on the regulations. So in some of them, you can still fish, dive, and use other activities. Marine protected areas, often because they're in open waters, it's not quite as easy as being in a country on land. They're often not federally managed, so they're not managed by national governments. Instead, they're managed kind of not haphazardly, but by various laws and jurisdictions from states and territories and tribes. So there's not quite so easy to standardize the management of marine protected areas as it is on protected areas that are on land. And even in the US here, there's no national mandate dedicated to set aside 1% of the oceans to marine protected areas. So in the US, there's no goal, I guess, as far as protecting our oceans and how much we should put into protected areas. Some of the solutions, a major one here, which we haven't talked about too much in class, is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. So the United Nations is a huge intergovernmental body that addresses, international issues. It's probably the major organization in the entire world that helps to manage international issues and challenges. So the Sustainable Development Goals are kind of phase 2 of what originally started out as the Millennium Development Goals, which you might have heard of. Those started in 2000. It went from 2000 to 2015. After that period was up, in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were drafted. I think, if I remember correctly, there's about 17 of them. And there is one, SDG 14, that is dedicated solely to oceans and marine ecosystems, basically. And I'll go through some of the targets. So each of these Sustainable Development Goals have specific targets. I didn't include all of them, but I included the ones that were most relevant to this lecture in this class. So a target 14.1 states that by 2025, we'll prevent and reduce marine pollution of all kind. By 2020, sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems. Excuse me. By 2020, conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas. So where that 10% number in the first slide came from. And then by 2030, increase economic benefits to small island developing states and least developed countries from the sustainable use of marine resources. So this acknowledges that these resources should be protected, but they also need to be, they're important for livelihoods. So how can we do that in a sustainable way? And then 14C is enhance the conservation and sustainable use of oceans and their resources by implementing international law. So these goals might seem really big for the whole world and kind of generalized, but actually this framework and these targets that the United Nations has come up with are actually really really important and really helpful when it comes to conservation efforts. The United Nations has is basically almost every country in the world is part of the United Nations, and these targets are something that's agreed on by every single country. So this is basically the world saying, or the governments of the world at least, saying, these are our priorities to make our world, the entire Earth, sustainable and to help with development. So a lot of these goals have to do with the environment, and a lot of them have to do with poverty and economics if you actually go through the entire list of all of them. So it's really about making this world better for people and for the environment, and why these are obviously really ambitious goals. They actually do help guide governments for what they should prioritize in their own policy, and they also guide funding. So while this may seem like kind of a pie in the sky lofty effort, in practice it actually is incredibly useful in guiding what the world prioritizes and what we do to meet those goals. So this is a very, very big picture scale, something that's being done to help protect ocean and marine resources. On a much more local scale, here's California's marine protected areas. There's 29, and they cover 18% of the state's marine area. So that's much higher than the 10% target for the entire world by this year. And it is important to also know that this is in California, these different categories of marine protected areas, but it is similar to the IUCN categories we went through for protected areas more generally, as far as having some that are more stricter as far as conservation goes, and some that are more focused on sustainable use. So at the top here, you have state marine reserves. That's the most strict conservation one. You have state marine park, state marine conservation area, state marine recreation management area, and then special closures. So basically it goes from most restricted to least restricted. So this map is just for Southern California. This exists for all of California as well. But it shows you how many marine protected areas there are, where they are, and what kind of reserve they are. So you can see a lot of them are actually that red color, which is the most strict conservation one, the State Marine Reserve. Southern California is a bit unique, where we have some of these just amazing island environments. So a lot of these protected areas are focused around, or the bigger ones at least, are focused around those island environments, ecosystems. And then there are still some, though, down in San Diego. You can see there's a few down in San Diego County as well. Some you may have been to, some you may have never heard of, but there are local places as well that you can visit. So to get even more specific, sorry, my face is in the way, protections for deep sea habitats and corals in the western US. So it's not only important to protect what's closer to the surface, but also to protect the fish and animals that live on the floor of the ocean. So this is recent legislation or rules finalized by NOAA Fisheries. It started this year. And it's extended these protections for these deep sea habitats, while also opening up fisheries in places where populations had been able to rebound. So these new protections run from Santa Barbara down to San Diego, where we are, and protect about 1,300 square miles of new land, new territory. Now, this is important because the ground fish, so there are certain fish species, obviously, that live on the bottom of the ocean floor. According to this article in Manga Bay, which was one of the other signed readings for today, these contribute 569 million to household incomes on the West Coast. So that is a huge number, and it shows kind of why these ground fish fisheries are important to conserve, because if they are fished to the point of unsustainable fishing, where there aren't any fish anymore, then that's going to take a huge economic impact. So that's kind of why this rule is passed, as far as opening up some new areas. So there still is economic opportunities for folks, but then closing other areas in order to help conserve some of those environments and some of those species. And then this is a collaborative effort. NOAA Fisheries, obviously, in collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and the Natural Resources Defense Council. So the Defense Fund and the Defense Council, those are the kind of organizations working on more legal issues, which is why they're able to get and help work with some of these bigger picture policies that actually need official laws, acts, frameworks, those kind of things. And then obviously the Endangered Species Act, which is what we went over recently. So out of the 200 listed species, 165 are marine species. 60 of those are mammals or sea turtles. So that's one way that some of these specific wildlife species are being conserved. All right, so the next topic is commercial whaling. This is not something that you maybe have thought about too much, but whales are hugely important to the ecosystems that they live in. It's also, for me at least, I look at whaling as kind of the conservation of whales is kind of somewhat from the intrinsic value. These are huge mammals, some of the biggest animals on Earth, and having them, like the fact that they exist, they should exist for the fact that they exist. These are incredible, incredible animals. Excuse me. So whales have been hunted for thousands of years for their meat, blubber, and oil. particularly in Arctic coastal communities, are often really very important as a source of food traditionally. However, due to, changes in technology and boats and everything, overhunting of whales has led to a very serious decrease in many populations of different whale species. And this is the whale species that are currently on the US's endangered species list. So how do you deal with an issue such as this? So what was basically happened is the International Whaling Commission was formed, I think back in the 40s, actually, so quite a long time ago. And this is the international, kind of like the United Nations, is the international governing body over whaling. As a lot of whaling takes place really far into the open ocean. It's something that needs to be governed not by one country, but by all the countries impacted and all the countries that have a say. So there's currently 88 member governments from countries all over the world. So most of these governments are obviously the places where whales are, and places along the coast. And they do, the IWC does a wide variety of things, from doing research, looking at conservation, as well as management. So they do allow subsistence whaling, or what they call Aboriginal subsistence whaling. This is kind of that long traditional cultural whaling. So there's 4 countries that are allowed to do this, including the US. There are certain communities in Alaska that are allowed to hunt a certain number of whales for cultural and livelihood reasons, as well as in Denmark, Greenland, and Russia. However, with that, that is the exception. Since 1982, I guess enforced in 1985, there's been a moratorium, or basically a ban on all commercial whaling. So it is currently, for countries that are part of the International Whaling Commission, it's currently illegal to whale hunt, or to hunt whales. This is enforceable. So member countries are responsible for investigating and reporting infractions and administering penalties. So each country is in charge for regulating themselves. Whether that's effective or not is up for debate. And there are also, it's also possible for a country with significant whaling to just not be part of the International Whaling Commission. They can drop out, and they aren't subject to this whaling moratorium. So that's some of the positives and some of the downsides for the International Whaling Commission. All right, now I'm kind of going through issues a bit fast. This is a big one though. So oil and gas pollution. That's oil and gas being basically dumped into the oceans. So this can happen from oil tankers, oil pipe leaks, drilling activities, even just small human activities like you're boating and you spill oil, that accumulates over time, and runoff from land pollution. And this figure kind of shows the breakup of how, where these different sources of pollution come from. So I don't know if you all are old enough to remember this, but Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened in 2010. This was a huge issue, as we'll talk about. It's the largest marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry. So this was the biggest oil spill that's ever happened, and it did happen, unfortunately, in the United States off the coast of Louisiana. The US government estimated that about 210 million gallons of oil were spilled into the ocean in that area. The really unfortunate part is that the spill began in April, and it was not fully fixed until September. So that's a long time, or a fairly long time period, that oil was spilling into the oceans. Because this is such a huge catastrophe, it obviously cost a lot of money to help clean up and to help deal with this. So in 2015, BP, or British Petroleum, which was the ones who owned the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, they paid $18.7 billion in fines, which is to date the largest corporate settlement in the history of the United States. So That's kind of appropriate, honestly. If this was the biggest oil spill, then they should have the biggest fine. And that money was very much needed as far as going up to the recovery efforts. The oil spill not only impacted the environment, which we'll talk about, but it also really impacted the local economy in the Gulf Coast. Folks who relied on fishing no longer could. Also, really importantly, folks that relied on tourism took a big hit as well. Folks are not going to want to come and lay, you're not going to go and relax on your beach vacation on a beach covered with oil, right? So that whole economy took a major, major hit. And here's just some stats I was able to find as far as the environmental impacts that are still being felt. So even in 2013, one study found infant dolphins were dying at 6 times the normal rate, dolphins in that area. 2014, they found tuna exposed to oil had developed deformities. Pelican eggs contained petroleum compounds. And then in 2012, 50% of shrimp were found lacking eyes and eye sockets. So this is obviously showing how bad and how devastating the impacts really were for local wildlife. Okay, so here's just some photos. You can see at the top is the actual oil spill. And then the bottom, a lot of the photos that were really dramatic, obviously, and were in the press were these birds, and these birds covered in oil, particularly pelicans. So with that, please do pause this video and go to this YouTube video. It's called The Gulf Oil Spill Disintegrated This Island, that talks really about one specific case of how the oil spill impacted one island, which was an incredibly important bird territory. So please do pause and go watch that video. All right, welcome back. As I'm sure you saw through watching that video, there were a lot of consequences of the oil spill just on that one small island. The thing that really stood out to me the most is kind of the ripple effect. So the fact that the oil spill was causing the mangrove forest to die, which was actually then causing the whole island to be swept away because it was the mangrove roots that were holding it together, is really, really kind of just shows these cascading effects of oil pollution. The real sad part is that birds can no longer nest there, and because they had been imprinted that they should nest there, they're no longer nesting at all. So those birds that used to once use that island for nesting are not, not nesting, they're not reproducing at all. And 5 years later, because this video is from 2015, there's still oil that's washing up on the island. So this is, something that despite the cleaning efforts that went into place, it's going to continue to have an impact on wildlife in this area for years to come. So what do you do? How do you regulate this? So the major policy solutions here are some of the regulations put in place by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. So they do have a few rules and regulations. The first one is the Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure Rule. This was originally part of the Clean Water Act, and was set to, set forth the requirement for the prevention of, preparedness for, and response to oil discharges at specific non-transport facilities. So it basically said that these businesses have to have a prevention plan and a response plan in place. And this original regulation was then amended in 1990 by the Oil Pollution Act, which I'll talk about as well. Another regulation put in place is a facility response plan. So similar to the top, it's really about having plans and being prepared for a worst case scenario. So this says facilities that store and use oil are required to prepare and submit a faculty response plan. Obviously, both of these regulations were in place before the Deepwater Horizon spill. So, and I don't know the details although I should look this up more, and it'd be interesting to know more about how, were these plans followed? So these, BP had to have these plans in place. What, were they just kind of paperwork that got pushed through, or were they actual significant plans that got followed once the oil spill happened? So the Ocean Pollution Act of 1990, this really kind of strengthened what was originally in the Clean Water Act to prevent and respond to catastrophic oil spills. So not a coincidence that this was passed in 1990 and 1989, which is what I remember from when I was a kid, basically, is that this Exxon Valdez oil spill, which happened up in Alaska, which was not as big as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, but was still quite significant. And this Ocean Pollution Act was passed, obviously, the year after that spill. I guess the important part is that this also establishes a fund to help deal with cleanup of some of these oil spills by taxing the oil itself. So that's kind of an innovative tax policy that exists in order to help there be money that's set aside and available to deal with oil spills. Also in California, there is a local office of Spill Prevention and Response. So there are these federal regulations, and there also are state offices and bodies that are working on regulating oil spills as well. Okay, so I think this is the last issue that I want to talk about today, and also maybe the largest. So climate change. Climate change impacts our oceans in many, many ways. This graphic calls it the triple threat for the ocean, because the CO2 that we're emitting, it heats up the ocean, and it also creates less oxygen in the ocean and makes the ocean more acidic, and all of these are problems. So the different boxes at the bottom kind of go through a lot of different impacts of climate change. So sea level rise, coral bleaching, toxic algae, there's lower oxygen levels in the ocean, so that can have negative impacts for animals who need that oxygen, obviously. Acidification, so more acid water also impacts a lot of animals as well as fisheries. Changing the ocean temperature and making it more acidic is going to impact the world's fisheries as well. So just a few of these kind of impacts at the bottom. So ocean acidification. There's a lot of chemistry involved here, and I'm going to be honest, I got a C in chemistry in college, so I hope this infographic helps explain it a bit. But basically, the CO2 gets absorbed into the ocean. The ocean actually does a very good job of absorbing CO2 from the environment, which is great as far as being a sink for carbon. However, that doesn't come without consequences. So the CO2 gets absorbed into the ocean. It creates carbonic acid. In order to do that, it needs carbonate. However, carbonate in the ocean is used by a lot of animals to help build their shells, including coral. So coral are no longer have carbonate to build their shells. And the acid in the ocean then also, because carbonic acid is an acid, so they can't build their shells, and because the water is more acidic, the current shells that they have degrade. Now, this obviously leads to a lot of issues for those ecosystems that rely on these corals, which impacts fisheries, which impact people. So this is kind of this very subtle, that's why it says a hidden impact of climate change, but still quite a big impact for both for the environment and for people. Sea level rise. This is something that's talked about quite a bit in the news because it's as ocean acidification is more of a hidden impact. This is very much an up close in your face impact. So climate change can impact sea level rise in multiple ways. One of the major ways is by melting water that's currently stored in ice. So that water is then is no longer in ice form, and then is in liquid form, which means there's more water in the ocean. Another thing that's actually a little less obvious is that through raising the temperature of the ocean water, it actually causes the water to expand. So this is physics, chemistry. Once again, those were not my strong points, but basically warmer water takes up more volume. So as the ocean warms, it'll just naturally expand, which will mean that the sea levels will rise. So that's, yeah, the rise in ocean temperatures is one of the main things that causes sea levels to rise. So you can see this graphic here. Shows this is for through 2014. So basically in 100 years, over 100 years, what has been the change in surface sea temperature. So this is looking at just the surface level of the ocean. You can see basically everywhere it has increased by a few degrees Fahrenheit, the one exception being in this area off of Greenland, which we'll talk about in a second. That's the anomaly as far as that is actually getting a little cooler. But this is, you know, disturbing to see that most of the world's oceans where we do have good data on this are warming. So this is where kind of that one little area, as I said, close to Greenland comes into play, is these ocean currents. So this picture on the left is kind of the general flow of water throughout the ocean. This obviously takes years and years and years for water to go through this whole entire cycle. But it shows how cold water is carried one direction, it warms up, it's carried the other direction, and particularly this area left of Europe, basically what's been happening is this cycle has been slowing down, which means that warm water is not getting to this area, it's not getting there as fast. So that's why that ocean is actually cooling down, because this conveyor belt is slowing down due to climate change. And this can have a huge impact on Europe, particularly because Europe is actually quite high in latitude. And it's really this kind of warm water coming in from the ocean that keeps the climate there warmer than it would be if it was, you know, if that kind of cycle didn't exist there. So that could have potentially in the future huge devastating impacts on the climate in Europe and making it much colder than it is currently. Okay, so how do we solve climate change? I'm gonna give it to you right now. Not really, but I'm gonna provide a few examples of some solutions or some policy solutions that are currently being implemented. And most of these, because climate change is a global problem, these are global solutions. So mostly intergovernmental action. So these are things you might have heard of already. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, they're the ones that put out those big scientific reports every 6 years or so. They are part of the United Nations, and they're really the ones that are doing and assessing the science. So they're looking at climate science. What does the science say? And the IPCC was created to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments. So it's meant to say, look, here's what the current state of science says about climate change. The IPCC was created back in 1988, and it has 195 member countries. So most of the countries in the world. Related to the IPCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is why the IPCC is the science piece. The UNFCCC is the policy piece. So their aim is to actually be the ones who are doing the management and the policy making. So they take the science from the IPCC and try to set frameworks for how to deal with climate change and how to lower greenhouse gas emissions. That says here the aim is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. It does set, unfortunately, non-binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions for individual countries. But just like a lot of these kind of international policy-making bodies we've talked about, it's really hard for them to enforce a lot of these rules. So they're trying to set emissions standards, but if countries don't meet those, there's really not a whole lot of enforcement that can go into place. We need to really rely on the countries themselves to then take action within their individual countries and to enforce it within their individual countries. And this was adopted in 1982. So you can see the science piece came first, followed by the policy. So international treaties can also be quite important. There's two major ones to talk about. So the Kyoto Protocol was kind of the first. It set up in Kyoto, Japan, which is why it's called the Kyoto Protocol, 1997. And this is kind of the actual treaty that came out of the UNFCCC, where countries said, yes, we commit to these regulations, to these goals as far as how much, you know, how much we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The follow-up of this more recently was the Paris Agreement, or you might have heard of the Paris Accord. This is only in 2015. There are 189 parties, and this deals with greenhouse gas emissions as well as mitigation, adaptation, and finance. Who's going to pay for a lot of these projects? And this was a little bit more specific than the Kyoto Protocol, where it actually had a goal to keep the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. As you may have seen in the news, Trump, a while ago at least, Trump did announce that he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement by 2020, November of 2020, so this hasn't actually happened yet. However, a lot of the policies that he's put into place nationally are really contrary to the Paris Agreement. So a lot of these policies are, while we haven't officially withdrawn, a lot of the policies don't get us to meeting those targets that were set during this. So what can I do? Those are some of the major issues I wanted to talk about, and it can be really overwhelming. So I want you to take 5 minutes. This is part of your in-class, participation activity. Take 5 minutes and write down at least 5 things that you yourself can do to maybe address some of these problems or address some of the other ones that were listed in the beginning, but what can you as an individual do? Because a lot of the policy solutions I talked about were at the policy level, right? They're national, state, international. Well, what can you actually do as an individual? So please do pause the video, take about 5 minutes to write these down. All right, welcome back. So I just wanted to come back to this, what can I do? And this is from, once again, the Newsweek article, which talked about a lot of different things. So here's just, this is by no means comprehensive. It's just a list of some things that we can do as individuals. So obviously you can use your vote. You can support local politicians and laws that protect the ocean. So go vote. Limit your use of plastic, unnecessary plastic. Think about what kind of seafood products that you're eating. Are they sustainably fished or unsustainably fished? And the Marine Stewardship Council is a good resource for information on that. If you're going to travel, go to places that support sustainable ecotourism projects. Buy locally to limit shipping pollution. Buy things that are made locally. Be mindful of your oil and gas usage, which goes along with, minimizing your carbon footprint. So think about not only, what you might think about normal climate change, but also how this can actually have benefits for the ocean as well. Beach cleanups, something very easy we can do here in San Diego. Also, you can volunteer. There are lots of ocean conservation related organizations here in San Diego. So just like how a lot of the issues we talked about were really broad, a lot of these individual actions you can take are also very broad, and honestly, most of them will not only benefit the oceans, but benefit just global sustainability and conservation efforts more generally. Okay, so what about San Diego? More specifically, and the marine protected areas in San Diego. I wanted to come back to that. So please, once again, pause the video and go to this YouTube video here, which talks about the protected areas in San Diego and some of the local conservation efforts that are going on. All right, welcome back. So that was hopefully really informative, and that video was put together by this organization called wildcoast.org. They're located here in San Diego. And they're basically a team of folks looking to conserve coastal ecosystems, and particularly looking at climate change. They have events in San Diego County, so whenever we can have events in San Diego County, again, I'd recommend going to one of those. And you can also volunteer with them, or they have internships as well, so you can actually get involved in helping to manage San Diego's marine protected areas. So I did have their website pulled up. Go away. Wild Coast, here we go. So they, kind of their slogan here on their website is a voice for the coast and the ocean. You can go to their website, learn more a lot about them, who they are, what their mission is, what they actually do. So a lot of this is focused directly on the oceans, obviously, where they work. It doesn't pop up automatically. You can join them. So like I said, they have volunteer internships. They even have careers. So as Dr. Bergen was really talking about in his lecture, go out there and get experience. If you want to work in ocean conservation or coastal conservation, intern, volunteer, get as much experience as you can, because it'll help you get a job later on. Said events, resources, blog, their Baja Bash, I think, is their major event. You can obviously donate as well. Okay, so that's one organization. Another one is San Diego Coast Keepers. They do a bit more variety of activities, I would say, as far as having advocacy, education, science, community engagement. They do a lot more outreach. So they'll do environmental education and things like that. And they also, just like Wild Coast, they also do have volunteer opportunities and internships. These internships are pretty broad. So if you're interested in nonprofit management, environmental law or policy, environmental education, beach cleanup, there's a lot of different things you can do. And I also do have their website pulled up. So for them, water issues, so they're looking a little bit more broadly. It is obviously about the ocean, but they also talk about watersheds that lead into the ocean, urban runoff. They talk about water supply, industrialization. So their mission is a little bit more broad. Our work, so anything from science to advocacy to outreach. Learn more about them. So they also have employee, like careers, internships, join the movement. So these are just two local organizations that you can learn more about and get involved with. So I think that is about it for today's lecture. Just like always, to complete today's lecture, go to Blackboard, go to discussions, click on April 20th participation, and go to ocean conservation. Create your own thread, and then answer the questions that are there. And this is to be completed before the next lecture. So for this one, the next lecture, we're still going to say is that Wednesday, even though there's no actual lecture because you have your peak time activity. So like I was saying, yeah, for Wednesday, peak time, no lecture. The rubrics due next Monday, and then for next Monday, I know we talked a bit about climate change today, but we're going to kind of keep on that topic, and it's going to focus on climate change and conservation. Because we already focused on marine environments, today we're going to focus more on terrestrial environments as far as the impact that climate change is having for conservation efforts. So with that, that is the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, as always, please email me, and I will be, just like always, have my office hours every Monday via Zoom from 2 to 3:30. So feel free if you have any questions about peak time or anything coming up on the horizon for class. All right, well, have a good rest of your day.